In 2012, a conspiracy theory spread like wildfire throughout the internet. This wasn't about Tupac still being alive or Jay-Z being a part of the Illuminati, but it questioned the very foundations of hip-hop itself. For many, it was a bit too believable to dismiss. In 2012, an anonymous letter was published on the blog Hip Hop is Red. The letter begins with, "After more than 20 years, I've finally decided to tell the world what I witnessed in 1991. Which I believe was one of the biggest turning points in popular music and ultimately American society." The author of this letter had chosen to remain anonymous and leave out the names of all the individuals involved too. However, what we do know is that this person is from Europe and was a prominent executive in the music industry at the time. The letter goes on to say, "In early 1991, I was invited to attend a closed-door meeting with a small group of music business insiders to discuss rap music's new direction. This meeting took place outside Los Angeles and involved 25 to 30 people. Although he noticed a lot of familiar faces in the room, some were not so familiar, and one of these unfamiliar faces began to tell him why they were invited. He explained that the companies we work for had invested millions into the building of privately owned prisons and that our positions of influence in the music industry would actually impact the profitability of these investments. A lot of confused faces could be seen across the room. But he then clarified why music executives were needed to help with the private prisons industry. We were told that these prisons were built by privately owned companies who received funding from the government based on the number of inmates. The more inmates, the more money the government would pay these prisons. It was also made clear to us that since these prisons are privately owned, as they become publicly traded, we'd be able to buy shares." Then the person explained that this was not just a lucrative business offering, but something their bosses wanted them to do. "Our job would be to help make this happen by marketing music which promotes criminal behavior, rap being the music of choice." He assured us that this would be a great situation for us because rap music was becoming an increasingly profitable market for our companies, and as employees, we'd also be able to buy personal stocks in these prisons. A deafening silence hit the room. Finally, someone shouted, "Is this a effing joke?" and was taken outside. According to the author, some people tried to intervene, but then one of the security guards pulled out a gun. The author of this note signed a confidentiality agreement and was told that he would suffer the consequences if he leaked this information. If he blew the whistle on this, he would at least lose his job, and given that there were guns involved, something much worse could have happened. The writer of this letter left the music business 2 years later, allegedly, and returned to Europe. He tried to forget what happened, but lo and behold, hip-hop became more bloody and violent, and their plan seemingly worked to a T. The letter closes with, "20 years of guilt is a heavy load to carry, but the least I can do now is to share my story, hoping that fans of rap music realize how they've been used for the past 2 decades. Although I plan on remaining anonymous for obvious reasons, my goal now is to get this information out to as many people as possible." A lot of people instantly believe this theory. The plausibility of this conspiracy theory lies in the fact that private prisons and gangster rap came to prominence at roughly the same time. In the late 1980s, the prison population skyrocketed because of the war on drugs and partially because of it, and President Reagan wanted to deal with the drug problem by locking up many people. As you can imagine, this move inevitably took its toll on state prisons, so the state decided to offload some of this burden onto private prisons. This environment led to the launch of America's 2 biggest private prison operators. In 1983, a company specializing in the management of private prisons called Corrections Corporation of America, which is today known as CoreCivic, came into business. A year later, Wackenhut Corrections Corporation, which is today known as GEO Group, also got in on the action. Central to this conspiracy theory is the fact that major investors in private prisons are also significant investors in the entertainment industry. The rapper Homeboy Sandman wrote an article about the company Vanguard Group Incorporated, which has increasingly become more popular in the past several years with other conspiracy theories. This corporation is the largest shareholder of Corrections Corporation of America and is also the 3rd largest shareholder of GEO Group. Coincidentally, Vanguard is also the 3rd largest shareholder in entertainment companies such as Viacom and Time Warner. Sandman then points out that the number 1 holder of both Viacom and Time Warner is a company called BlackRock. This investment company is also the 2nd largest holder in Corrections Corporation of America, second only to Vanguard, and the 6th largest holder in GEO Group. This supports the theory that entertainment and private prisons are both intertwined, but as I'll get into later, it's a little bit more complicated than that. As privately owned prisons grew in the 80s, so did hip-hop. and there was a gradual switch from conscious hip-hop to gangsta rap. The politically charged lyrics of Public Enemy and KRS-One switched to more violent music like NWA. An article in the LA Times described this transition as, Public Enemy had already helped redefine the genre by ushering in aggressively pro-black raps that were intelligent, socially aware, and politically charged, but NWA opted for an angrier approach. The group celebrated the hedonism and violence of gangs and drugs that turned neighborhoods into war zones, capturing it in brazen language soaked in explicitness. The best example of this switch happened to a rapper named Too Short. He told Hip Hop DX, I noticed that at a certain point in hip hop, the major labels stopped signing and promoting the positive artists, the ones that was just really positive. Positive images were hard to get out there. So I'm just saying that at some point, it wasn't that hip hop changed on its own. It had a little push. He recalls one situation where he was literally told to push his music in a particular direction. I wanted to do a whole album of positive Too Short songs, just to keep that balance. I had made a verbal deal with Barry Weiss, where he was like, right now would be a perfect time. You should do like the raunchiest Too Short album ever. The album cover, the songs. Just do a dirty effing Too Short album. This is the executive running the company advising me to put out an entire album of just cursing and sex. His follow-up album about positivity was never made. So Too Short is a verifiable witness of record labels deliberately trying to make music more violent. However, there are many holes in this tale of this quote-unquote secret meeting. This theory was discussed on the Dead End Hip Hop YouTube channel where Mike C. Town pointed out some significant flaws. He explained that the meeting happened in 1992, and NWA's Straight Outta Compton and Ice-T's Power both came out in 1988. So the horse had already bolted by then. However, some would say that perhaps it started out organically, but they saw how they could profit on it and decided to accelerate it afterwards. That being said, the early 90s saw gangster rappers like Snoop Dogg, Tupac, and Cypress Hill come to the forefront as well. The blogger Norm Shriver pointed out that the secret poster of this letter didn't really do a good job at hiding his anonymity. He wrote, he's left a lot of breadcrumbs for someone who wanted to remain anonymous. How hidden is his identity if he's told that he was one of 30 major decision makers in the music industry working for one of the big firms in 1991, who came over from Europe in the 80s and quit in 93? That's about as anonymous as a fat guy hiding behind a skinny tree. Shriver also pointed out that this information was not sent to a mainstream publication, but the blog Hip Hop is Red. He wrote, no offense to them, but I tend to believe an email to Rolling Stone, The Source, the LA Times, etc. would come to mind first. In fact, if you were in the industry that long, you'd know just about every major music writer, and could disseminate this information with a lot more credibility, in a much less clumsy fashion, by picking up the phone and calling an old friend, off the record. His best point comes later in the article, where he proposes a short thought experiment. What if instead of tweaking the direction of hip-hop, they tweaked a predominantly white music genre like country music? So you're telling me that if these record executives met and decided to promote country western music, instead our jails would only be half filled and the societal issues in the hood would be less inflamed? That's ridiculous and insulting to the plight of real people who struggle against the throat lock of disenfranchisement every day. This would also make sense from a numbers standpoint. For instance, if the majority of America was white and they decided and they wanted to maximize the amount of people in prison, then it would make sense that they would go to majority white consumed genres and influence them in a negative way to commit more crimes. However, this does circle back to the thought that hip-hop had already started off with NWA, and then 2 years in, it's much easier for them to fan the flames than try to kindle a flame. Although it is true that BlackRock and Vanguard have invested in both private prisons and entertainment, they invest in just about everything. In fact, part of their business model is to diversify into as many industries as possible. Had they only invested in hip-hop and private prisons, then this theory would have held more water. And lastly, who does this person who wrote this letter think listens to gangsta rap? Michael Rain from the Huffington Post pointed out, most damning for the prison-filling conspiracy theory, the rising sales of gangsta rap albums in this period were driven by the allowances of suburban white kids, not exactly the demographic that sinister plots steer into the prison system. While this is a good point made, it doesn't change the fact that the environment that these non-suburban kids or inner city kids are living in makes it a lot more easier for them to enact what these rappers are talking about, whereas these suburban kids are so much far removed from it. While The Secret Meeting is probably a work of fiction, the reason why it got so much traction is that there were grains of truth in this discussion, and it was woven into a believable story. The Louder Than a Riot podcast believes that this letter did not even have to be real. Carmichael said, "The hype around this letter, fake news or not, it really tells us that the fear and the paranoia around how the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts black people in this country is very real." He later points out that, at its core, gangsta rap was a product of the drug war, a reaction to mass incarceration, not the other way around. And once the music started to mirror these certain stereotypes around black criminality, instead of asking whether this meeting took place at all, they used the theory as a jumping off point. They talk about how profitable the prison system can be and how the money to be made from incarcerated people is not a conspiracy theory. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, they estimate that the prison and jail industrial output is $2 billion, and this all hinges upon the 13th Amendment in the Constitution, which is often referred to as the slavery loophole. There was a big documentary done on this, I believe even Pusha T was involved, called The 13th. It was on Netflix and stuff like that. When slavery was ended after the Civil War, there was one small caveat. A 13th Amendment was introduced to the Constitution, which read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime." Essentially, they interpreted it as you can still use people for slavery when they're in prison. Killer Mike from Run the Jewels has been very vocal on this topic and said, "We never talk about the fact that slavery is still legal, and because slavery is still legal, there's a need to fill the void of slaves. So absolutely, I believe damn near any conspiracy that talks about putting poor people in jail because there's a profit margin to be made for doing it. So it's not if I can believe it or not, it's look at the proof is in the pudding. Look at what you're seeing, you know. So the question is though, now what are we going to do about it?" Common has also commented on this subject in his song Letter to the Free, where he rhymes, "The cage birds sing for freedom to bring, black bodies being lost in the American dream, blood of black being a pastoral scene, slavery still alive, check Amendment 13. This song was part of the soundtrack for the documentary that I mentioned earlier, 13th, which gets into a deeper dive on this topic, although it is heavily biased in one direction. But for better or for worse, conspiracy theories spark excellent conversations. And in this case, this particular theory hit upon so many different topics where proper conversations were long overdue. Make sure to subscribe for more.